All right, so as you mentioned, we're going to talk about really 3 overlooked takeaways that can reduce worker injury when we talk about fall protection in general. There's a lot of confusion out there sometimes. We think fall protection immediately, people think of fall arrest, wearing a harness and protecting from that leading edge. But when we talk about fall protection, it really is a much bigger picture. And that can be falling objects, that can be walking working surfaces along with the leading edges and holes and things like that. So, in that context, this presentation really is about focusing on fall protection and that standard. And let's see here, trying to switch the slides here. We might have to, okay, there we go. So the agenda today, we want to start with just first off, why did we put together this webinar? We want to talk about what the problem is right now in the construction industry specifically, and how we've arrived to some of the fatality and injury numbers that we have. And then we're going to touch on 3 key aspects of fall protection. This includes tool tethers, rescue plan and equipment, and inspection of equipment. For our presenters today, obviously, I'm speaking right now. Just a quick background on myself. I entered the construction space probably always knowing I was going to enter construction. I started in architecture, and during my time in architecture school, I worked in the emergency room at the local hospital. It was through that experience that, you saw a lot of injuries come in. And the question, of course, when you worked in the ER was you always asked, how did it happen? And it was interesting to hear the stories of how some of these injuries and incidents occurred. And it occurred to me that there was just a huge opportunity out in the workplace to prevent these issues from happening. And so my passion's always been a construction realm, but at that point in time, I shifted my focus and felt, that there could be a much larger impact on people, society, and the construction industry by focusing on occupational safety and the prevention of incidents. And so my focus has been, since day one, getting into this profession, really focusing on 2 things. What are the company systems and culture needed to drive good decision making by the employees and by leadership? So Rob Lucky, who is also our second presenter here, is the Midwest sales manager for FALLTECH. And FALLTECH is one of the top fall protection firms out there that develops fall protection equipment, tethering, as we'll talk about, and different things like that. I've known Rob since the day I've gotten in this industry, so it's been well over 15 years. He's taught me a lot, maybe more on golf than than occupational safety, but it's when it comes to fall protection, he's the expert. And I've learned a heck of a lot from him, as many people in the industry have as well. And he's worked for some of the largest fall protection companies over his career, so to say he's, with FALLTECH is probably not just doing him justice. He's got a huge amount of experience. So we really wanted to bring together, 2 people in this presentation, one to answer some of those questions that, maybe you haven't gotten answered before or you have concerns on, and also just to share our perspective on how we can solve this issue with falls in the workplace. So let's start with the problem here. When we just look at the statistics that have come out, and 2019 is the latest statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics out there. You look at the top causes of occupational fatality in that year, there's 5,333 fatalities in total. Now, interestingly, that was a 2% increase from the year before. And where those injuries were happening, and this could be another topic to think about, but from an age demographic, this was between ages 55 and 64. Now, that's 1,212 incidents total. And the reason I mention that is when we talk about falls, again, I want you to think bigger picture, not just leading edge, but think about walking, thinking about climbing stairs on the job site, walking from the vehicle to the job site, things like that, and holes and things like that that might be in there. And you start to realize as we tend to age, we don't have as quick reaction time. And so it's possible that some of these fatalities that we see in that age group are largely attributed to falls in the workplace. And so if we want to stop that trend, this is an area we can now focus. But as you see on the chart here, transportation, of course, and we all know this is number one. And transportation has, a little over 2,000 incidents a year on the fatality side of it. Now from the fall protection, fall slips and trips, that was 880 in this category. And in third place is the violence in the workplace, which was 841. And I can tell you over the different years, sometimes we will see violence in second place in falls. But if you look at just those two numbers between 880 and 841, they're really not too far off from each other. If we didn't look at the fatalities and we looked at non-occupational fatalities, meaning things where people had restricted cases, lost time cases, or first aid type cases, type injuries, there was a little over, there was in first place in that area was sprains and strains. And in second place was transportation related incidents. And I think that's an interesting thing to know, because a lot of times we find the sprains and strains coming from walking, working surfaces, and of course, material handling. So there's certainly a reason here that we could be talking about fall protection. But even not only just the statistics from the Bureau that we look at, but when you look at OSHA's most recent frequently cited violations in 2020, that first little box in the top left corner there, it, of course, is falls. And this is failure to provide fall protection systems specifically. Now, that language is critical, because when I say systems, again, it's not just fall arrest, it's systems. So that's everything we're talking about. That includes, the falling objects, the walking, working surfaces, the work at height, holes and wall openings and leading edges. And a lot of it is attributed to residential roofing. We see quite a bit in that area, but there are still quite a bit in the commercial sector. It's interesting to note that fall protection in this category has been number one for 10 years. So it's almost been a decade. So we haven't made a whole lot of movement in that area. Also, if you kind of go across, see to the right there, HASCOM was in second. Just to put it in perspective, there was 5,424 violations in the first category, the number one spot, fall protection. And then there's 3,199 violations in the HASCOM. There's definitely a big difference between that first and second place. And I'm not going to go over these 10 for the sake of time. You could certainly look that up, but you'll also find that fall protection training is down in the top 10 as well. So certainly a reason for pause and to look at this issue. The other thing I would point out is a lot of times, and you could almost call this a myth, but a lot of times people think falls are at height. It's the high-rise buildings and working up, 20 feet, 30 feet or higher is what's going to kill you and causing these fatalities. Interestingly, almost half of all the fall fatalities occurred at 15 feet or less. So you think about that, that's one story up, that's climbing a ladder, that's on a one-story residential roof, maybe a two-story. These are lower heights. And so again, when we look at these stats, it's important to kind of understand where this is all coming from. So when we look at the problem, a lot of people will look at this and say, well, the employee is the issue. They're not following the safety procedure. They're not using the right equipment. I took this picture well over a decade ago when we were building this building that you see on the right side. And I put the picture there just so you can see the perspective of the height of this building and the hazard and risk that was there. And if you go to that left side of the picture, you'll notice this guy's putting up his rigging to clean the windows. And of course, it's for his bosun chair and it's his fall arrest rigging to do it safely. But yet he's got a ladder leaning against a round column on the corner of the building, well over 10 stories, 12 stories in height. And most people might look at this picture and say, well, he made that decision to work unsafe, and that risk was his fault. You know, I'd encourage you to think about the system and ask the question, how did we arrive to that situation where you had to make that decision? You know, if this is a typical window cleaner, was there a plan, you know, of using a scaffold? Was there a plan on attaching to that anchor point, knowing that that anchor point you couldn't reach from standing on the ground level at the rail height? And I'd probably argue that in this company's particular case, you know, these guys came out in a truck with a ladder on there, and they looked at the situation, says, well, we don't have any other equipment, so we're going to grab what we got, and it's safe enough for us. So when we talk about fall protection, the success in fall protection is all in the pre-planning. There's complex issues as well when we talk about fall protection, and one of them is swing fall. And this is one of the first resources I wanted to provide to you guys. I developed a little spreadsheet, and you'll get this after the presentation. It's a little swing fall chart. It's hard for a lot of people to grasp how far you can walk depending on how high your retractable is, and avoid swing fall or more or less hitting the ground. And you can see on the picture on the left there, that's an example of what a swing fall is as you walk away from that anchor point, you will always fall in line with that anchor point once you fall. And you take the scenario on the right side here where you have a skywalk. This is, of course, the skywalks are long. They're not very high off the ground. It might be at most 20 feet, but between that 15 to 20 feet in most cases. And if someone was tied off to a lanyard at D-ring height, they're going to hit the ground. Now, if they had swing fall as a factor, which obviously if you're installing this glass like this company was, they're not going to be directly next to that retractable. So they're going to have additional fall clearance that they're going to have to deal with. You know, and you can see in this picture, they addressed it by putting some retractables across the column where they can maintain that 100% tie off by pulling down that retractable with a rope and connecting. But, you know, if this was planned out, there's probably better solutions, you know, like a horizontal lifeline and getting that mounted overhead. So again, you know, I would say that the success in fall protection truly is in having some kind of pre-planning for all these unique cases out there. Once you do pre-plan, it's amazing of some of the solutions that you're going to find. Let's take this common example on a job site right to the left here. You know, we transition from one level to another level with an extension ladder. And while this is in compliance with the regulation, there still is a potential for someone to fall walking by that ladder or accessing that ladder. And so a simple solution is what they would call an offset rail, or essentially an L-shaped rail, so that it protects that opening. And again, it's thinking beyond the compliance side of things and really looking at the hazards and trying to prevent people from getting themselves in trouble or making a bad decision. When that's successful, you go to the picture to the right here on this job site. You know, we talk about walking working surfaces, and you can see just in the picture how muddy things are, how much of a mess it is. And imagine if you had a rough terrain forklifts walking or driving through there and vehicles and things like that, how much worse it would be. But this company had the forethought to say, we're going to make a pedestrian path to this job site. And in doing so, they've delineated it, marked it off with some rope and essentially put some flat gravel down so there wasn't any trip hazards. This is the kind of thing that couldn't be done if we didn't plan for it once we got to the job site. So a lot of what Rob is going to talk about really does involve having a plan to start with. And so before I turn it over to Rob, I wanted to share one story with you that occurred just a few years ago. There was a man delivering drywall on a New Jersey construction site. Now, he was killed when a tape measure fell 50 stories, a tape measure, like you see on the screen here. The tape measure struck his head. This 1-pound tape measure became dislodged from the belt of a worker on the 50th floor, and it struck some construction equipment on the way down, and then it ricocheted, and it struck a 58-year-old worker who had just stopped to speak with another worker who was in a pickup truck just before 9 a.m. In the city's downtown section is where this was located. The employee died shortly before 10 a.m. So again, it wasn't much time. He was not wearing a hard hat, but had one in his truck at the time. And of course, the job site had the signs posted, 100% hard hat, 100% safety glasses. An employee from the New York-based company said he's a very good worker. He's been with us a long time. A former construction worker near the site told the newspaper, "You don't work in this environment without a hard hat." He paid the price. The man sadly said, "You gotta have it." Workers at the construction site were temporarily cleared after the accident, but resumed their jobs at the site later in the afternoon. So it's interesting to note the job continues and it still gets done, even after the fatality and after a serious incident. The question is, was there a plan in place? And if you think about it, this is a job site that had safety nets, it had guardrails in place, it followed all the OSHA rules and all the OSHA regulations that are out there. But did anyone think about the impact that a tape measure could have at 50 stories above or 3 stories above? And how much force, once it gets to the terminal velocity, it could have when it hits someone in the head? Again, most people look at this and say, well, the employee failed. He didn't have his hard hat on. He didn't wear the correct PPE that he should have had. But it wasn't the PPE that caused the incident. The PPE, keep in mind, doesn't stop the incident from happening. All it does is reduce the severity and the potential impact of that incident. If we were going to stop that incident, we had to look and think about the objects up above, and how a tape measure, as an example, on a belt that we've all dropped if we've worked in construction or done any construction, could become a lethal weapon or a lethal object at height. And so it's that kind of planning that's truly going to be proactive and prevent incidents. And so I'd encourage people, as you leave this webinar, to think about the systems you have in place and the planning. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Rob, who's going to go into detail on these 3 specific topics that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. If you can turn over to the, let's see if I have control now. Let's see here.
Give you control.
Let's see. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. I don't think I do. All right. It's not letting me take control. Okay. Well, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. I'm Rob Lucky. I'm the Midwest Regional Manager for FALLTECH. I've known Josh for many, many years, longer than 15 years. I've been in the fall industry over 20 years. Today, we're going to talk about 3 areas of fall protection. Fall protection is an ongoing challenge, like Josh talked about, that every year we still hold the #1 most RIN violation by OSHA, not to include, in scaffolding, ladder safety, and then, believe it or not, training. Training, a lot of companies still aren't following training, and some companies will issue fall protection to their employees, and some of their employees don't know anything about fall protection. But Josh was talking about fallen objects, and that's one of the areas that we want to kind of start with. Is in the industry for many, many years, tool tethering is just now starting to come into play in the last couple of years. There's lots of manufacturers out there that make tool tethers, but a lot of people don't think about, what it does, or the falling objects. Like Josh's story, how can potentially hurt or kill somebody. Every day, every minute, somebody's dropping a tool. Think of being at home and working. How many times have you dropped your tool or any equipment at home, or your cell phone? I know my 20-year-old daughter would drop her cell phone about at least once a quarter, and I was replacing her screen. And we all drop our cell phones. On a job site, the heights can do serious damage. One of the stories that I have actually is out of Philadelphia. Just about 1.5 to 2 years ago, a gentleman was working 3 stories and dropped his ratchet, and it fell 3 stories down. It hit a beam, and the socket itself shot another 70 feet and planted into a car window. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but again, that's basically a bullet, and the socket went 70 feet and went into somebody's car window. So nowadays, manufacturers like FALLTECH and other many brands out there have tool tethers. It's not just as easy as finding a few online, buying them, and putting the tools together. We're going to kind of look at the charts here. We have the tool attachments. Those are what will actually go onto the tool. The tethering, the tool tether, different links and lanyards that will connect to that attachment. And another big thing is the wrist attachment. And the important thing about that is a lot of people will, when we're on a construction site, we talk about 100% tie off, which the easiest way for me to say 100% tie off is think of when you were a kid, or if you have kids, doing the monkey bars. They're connected on both hands. They disconnect, connect to another one, connect, disconnect. That is 100% tie off. At any given time, you cannot fall because you are connected all the time. Same thing came into tool tethering. Is sometimes when you're putting a tool back into your belt or back into the box, people will let go or it will slip out of your hand. We actually now make equipment that you can actually connect from your connector to, if you're handing it to somebody, if I was handing Josh a tool, he could actually connect to the tool right along with me so that that tool is 100% connected to one of us. Kind of looking at some of the different attachments that will go along with that. Again, adding to the different tools, we use tape. Every manufacturer has different criterias. If you look at FALLTECH, you look at other brands, they're all maybe vary because of the different tapes we use. We test all of our equipment with ANSI. It meets or exceeds the ANSI standards. But everybody's setup may be a little bit different. So whoever you may be using, make sure that you're reading their manuals. And the tool attachments and lanyards will have different weights. Most commonly, it'll be either a 2, a 5, a 10, a 15, on up to a 30-pounder. Some of your equipment may have eyes already built in, and you won't have to add an attachment to it. Some of our heavier equipment we can add on, like our power tools here. We can actually add on up to a 30-pound attachment. It's taped on. There is a time period, again, depending on the manufacturer, that attachment will need to be taken off and a new one will need to put it on. It's not like inspecting your harness. It does have a time frame. And again, like Josh said, this is going to be a presentation you guys can go back and look at. And again, other manufacturers will have all this available for you. We at FALLTECH also do make posters like a lot of our competitors out there. So these are free of charge. So let us know. This is specifically for our product, but again, manufacturers will have it. They should be free of charge. These are great for in the trailers, in the shop, anywhere you're doing tool tethering. It's important, excuse me, to have those posters available. With our time constraint here, moving quickly on to our next part, one of the biggest things when we talk about our ABCs and Ds of fall protection, we always train people how to wear the harness, how to inspect it, how to put it on correctly, store it. One of the biggest things when I do training that I ask the first question is if I go onto a job site in the event that I would fall, how are you rescuing me? And a lot of times we will have just blank stares at us. This is very, very crucial that any job site that you have people in fall protection or at heights, in the event that they fall, we need to have a rescue plan ready for them. Whether it may be a ladder, a lift, you may have to have a high angle rescue trained team there for rescue. If dialing 911 is your answer, you need to reach out to that closest fire department to make sure that they're aware of how to do the training. Even fall protection or even in confined space, a lot of the fire departments aren't prepared for it, and it's still going to take time for them to get there. So if they can't be there in 15 minutes, that's not a good thing. So having your own self-rescue team ready to be able to rescue somebody is very, very important, and making sure you have the right equipment to do the rescue. Trained employees. In the picture here, you see actually somebody doing a descent device. We make equipment that basically is very hands-on, very, I don't want to say non-technical, but it's something that they can click into their anchor point, connect to the fallen person, pull off the tension off the retractable or lanyard, and then the person can be released, and it will drop them up to 2.5 feet per second down safely. So by the time the fire department or the paramedics get there, they'll be on the ground, hopefully already receiving first aid. And get with your fall protection provider, and they will have rescue equipment available. This is an example of the FALLTECH. We make it at 150 and 300. We can actually do up to 1,600 feet. But this is a descent device. There's also actually a pole that when the person is below foot level, that a 20-foot pole that can actually reach out to their D-ring and clip the system to it. One of the newest things out there, and I say the newest, it's a lot of manufacturers now are starting to add this permanently onto their equipment, is what we call suspension trauma straps. In the event somebody falls, we hope through all the training that they would have this harness on correctly. But we've all been on job sites. We've all seen people wearing their harnesses very loosely. I've seen people that have the vest on and their leg straps aren't even on. And so, you know, the training of making them wear the harness correctly is very important. But at the same time, if they're in an area that it may take a little bit of time to do the rescue, a lot of manufacturers now have the suspension trauma straps, and they can easily be deployed. And as they show here with this gentleman there, he is standing there, it's keeping that blood flowing. And that's very, very important because your major artery is right below your waist. And so this is a example of the FALLTECH trauma straps. It's just a strap that when somebody falls, you'll pull out both sides and you'll connect them. And like the previous picture, a gentleman or a person will stand in that. They can also recline it back so that they can actually sit in their harness or readjust their harness. So that, again, that we want to keep that blood flowing until they are rescued. And then most importantly, as the conclusion of the presentation for me is the inspection. A lot of our people say they inspect their equipment. You need to emphasize that with your users. By OSHA, they're supposed to inspect their equipment prior to use every day that they wear it, or if they're wearing it all day and they take it off and put it back on, technically they should be inspecting it. And a lot of times people will just assume that, you know, it's going to work. For the anchors, the tie-off adapters, check the webbing, looking for the broken stitches, stiff, worn, if there's paint on there or some chemical. This cross-arm strap is yellow. If this is gray, I would pull it out of service. Anchors, whether they be permanent or temporary, those need to be inspected on a regular basis. A competent person, meaning having the authority in construction, should be twice a year and documented. In general industry, it's once a year that needs to be documented. The equipment, the harnesses, here's the components. Again, look at the hardware, the webbing, the stitching, the labeling. Our harnesses for FALLTECH, we actually have a fall indicator built into them. And in the event somebody falls, you can see where it says stop, remove from service. So if anybody sees a harness that has those indicators pop, we know that harness is no good. We'll want to pull it out, cut it up, and discard it. On our website, and like a lot of other manufacturers, we have documentation, and it does not matter. A lot of companies use multiple brands, but a competent person should be inspecting this equipment once or twice a year. Some people do it more than that, which is great, but it's a simple Excel spreadsheet, and it can say any brand on it. That's not brand specific. Just make sure you note what brand it is, the serial number, if there's any wear or tear, and if it passes or fails. And then on the harness, looking at the harness again, we talked about the inspection, again, checking the hardware, the D-ring, the friction buckles, the leg straps, whether they be quick connect or tongue buckle. We want to make sure that that harness is in good working condition. Lanyards, make sure that, I guess that's my time. Make sure that the shock packs aren't deployed or opened. Even if they are open just a little bit, you want to pull them out. Make sure that there's no fraser cuts or burns with those. Retractables, same thing, check if they're webbing, check the webbing. If they're steel cable, please wear gloves. Make sure that there's no broken fibers on that or cable. And then if you pull on it above the snap hook, you should hear that lock up. That way you know that the braking mechanism will work. Okay. And then we, as a manufacturer, like a lot of other manufacturers, you go to our website, we have a lot of stuff on there for training and or how to do videos. And so Josh and Teresa, thank you for your time today.
Yeah, if there's any questions, I think you can submit those through the Q&A on the bottom of your screen there, and we'll be happy to answer any of them right now. Or if you have any, you can certainly reach out by our email or cell phone that's listed is fine as well, and visit with us. So we'll hang on here for a little bit longer. If you don't have any questions, feel free to take off, and we appreciate you joining this webinar with us. Otherwise, we'll be happy to answer questions. Looks like we got one question here. It says, is there a shelf life for retractable lanyards? That's a great one for Rob to answer.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. Many people have heard, fall protection in general needs to be replaced every 5 years. ANSI now says that as long as it passes the competent inspection, again, a person having authority, usually a safety person or a supervisor who's gone through the training, there is no shelf life. If it's webbing, they need to inspect it. For retractables, again, depending on if it's webbing or steel cable, the way they inspect it, most of the retractables, 15 foot on up to 100 foot or longer, can actually be repaired or rebuilt. But there is no shelf life on fall protection. So yeah, there is no shelf life as long as it passes an inspection. If you ever have equipment that you look at and question it, what we always say is in doubt, throw it out. Overall, it's not that expensive, but if you have questions, Josh, myself, be happy to help you out.
Yeah, and I think that's key. Why we're talking about inspection as being one of the key attributes to a good fault protection program is, you mentioned the shelf life as being one of the key conditions there. And I always ask the question, I pull something up from the vendor and it had been sitting on their warehouse for a year or two. And the question was, well, am I already into that 5 years or not? And so yeah, it's a great answer. There's another question here. Says, how do you become or trained to be a competent person? You want to answer that, or I can
Sure.
answer that?
Like FALLTECH, like many of our competitors, we hold actually competent training courses. By OSHA, a competent person who's had 16 hours of fall protection training, classroom training is what it takes. And we give you a certificate, and we go through the inspection and all the do's and don'ts of fall protection. It's usually a paid class. There are classes online. Sometimes the National Safety Council will actually hold classes, but it's a 16-hour 2-day class, usually to be a competent person. Some companies go beyond that and do a train the trainer, and that's a 5-day class for them to be able to train other people to be competent. And then along with that, your wearers should be trained, go through a refresher course once a year by you or somebody, usually like an hour and a half, on, again, proper inspection, donning, some of the basics of fall protection.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that just a little bit. When you look at the definition under OSHA of what a competent person is, in simple terms, they're saying a competent person is someone who has knowledge and who has authority. And so there isn't a set standard to say, you have to have this much training or you have to do this. It can vary, but they have to have the knowledge in what they're doing. So if they're going to be a rescue person, they have to have knowledge in that rescue equipment. They have to have knowledge about suspension trauma and the timing of getting that employee down as quick as possible and those kinds of things, and not putting themselves at risk. And then the second part is they have to have authority. To be able to stop work, as an example, and make a decision. And that's different from a qualified person who has some kind of recognized degree or certificate. And those are the two terms that OSHA uses a lot throughout the standard. But the competent person is determined by the employer, and it's up to the employer to really get that knowledge and determine that person. So we have another question here. The question is, what is the big difference on slab edged retractables and regular retractables? So I think they're talking about your leading edge retractables.
Okay. Yes. Leading edge is becoming another issue. A lot of steel companies and or concrete companies, when they're doing decking, the retractables are usually used at a horizontal, or where they're tied off basically behind them at foot level. When people would fall, that cable will have contact with the edge. And actually in Omaha, about 12 years ago, a gentleman was working and he fell and had a swing fall, like Josh had pointed out early on, and it basically cut his cable. Most manufacturers' standard retractables are using a 3/16 cable. We use a 7/32 cable for our leading edge, which is about twice the size, so of the abrasion. The other thing you'll see in a leading edge is whether it's steel, and right now ANSI only tests leading edge against a steel. And concrete can actually be even more abrasive or hard on the cable. But when somebody would fall, that cable can bind into the concrete or the steel. And then you'll see on leading edge units now, they'll have a retract or a soft pack on there, which is designed to take the forces for the person on that retractable. There's braking mechanisms inside the retractable that's going to protect the anchor, and then that shock pack is actually what's going to help reduce the fall forces of the victim or the person who falls.
Yeah, and then you also got to keep in mind your additional fall clearance distance.
Oh, exactly.
With those kinds of systems. So
exactly.
Yeah. So if there's, we're happy to stay on and answer more questions. That was the last question I saw come in. So feel free to ask a few more. We'll stick on for a few minutes or as long as need be. And we'll just kind of hang out here for a minute or so before we close the session.
Yeah, and not just trying to promote FALLTECH. Again, check with your other fall protection companies out there. But for us, if you go to FALLTECH.com, like the leading edge, we actually have a video on leading edge, and it will talk about a lot of the differences and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And fall protection is one of those areas, you know, to do this for a half hour, we're trying to cram a lot into a short amount of time. And when I do a competent training class, again, that's 16 hours. I can do this for 4 days. And Josh has seen me do it for 4 days. And fall protection, I've been doing it for a long time. Every situation, every minute of every day, there's always something that's different. And fall protection companies can also help you analyze and look at your hazards. It may be not just off the shelf type of product that you need. We may need to get our engineers involved and or one of your engineers and help you engineer maybe the hazard out. So most of your fall protection companies can assist you in that too.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great point. I think in industry, a lot of people aren't aware that you could call on some of your vendors to help design a specific fall protection system for your unique situation. And if you're on a job site that might have a challenging area, again, a great resource. But, you know, this goes back to what I said at the beginning of the presentation. It really has a lot to do with the pre-planning side of it. You know, you've got, if you're going to do that and get them involved, you have to do it and think about it before you get to the job site. Last column questions. I'm not seeing any come through. If there are any more, here we go. So the question is it possible to add trauma straps to existing fall protection harnesses, or do they have to be purchased as a unit? You can take that, Rob. That's easy.
Great question. You can buy trauma straps for and add them onto any equipment. So they're not just manufactured on. And believe it or not, I'm a believer. I like to add my own on to my harnesses, is because they're not a one and done. And with trauma straps, when we do training, I always like to have the wearers actually pull out their trauma straps and connect them and get them adjusted. So in the event that they would fall, they have some working knowledge of how that works. So to answer the question, yes, you can buy trauma straps separate and add them to any harness. And for FALLTECH, I know I've seen other brands of trauma straps on our equipment and our trauma straps on other equipment. So that doesn't even have to be brand specific. Great question.
Okay, well, I think we'll stop there. If there's anything else, feel free to email us.